Well, shalom. You know, it's a Hebrew word for peace, and of course there isn't any, there isn't any is a little bit overstated, but not much, certainly in the Jewish world. As you know, it's extremely difficult, and even people that are paying attention to what's happening in the world observe it's particularly difficult right now. Pastor Steve, let's see. How do I go back? Pastor Steve asked me to come down and speak to, for, and about the subject of anti-Semitism in history and prophecy. It's a very ugly subject. I don't know what your experience is with Jewish peoples, but you may well observe, at least now when Jewish issues are kind of foisted on the world stage, it's really kind of bizarre and bombastic the way people interface with Jewish peoples, and you hear in different ways on different days from different angles about this insidious hatred of Jews. Now, to be sure, Jewish people, and I'm of Jewish extract, we have our scoundrels. But they tend to be rather far and few between. Pound for pound, Jews tend to be a reasonably good lot. You know, and it raises the question to look at the source of anti-Semitism. And what I want to do here in brief is, as the title informs, look at anti-Semitism in history and prophecy. That's a picture that was taken of me not long ago there by the Kotel in Jerusalem, by the Western Wall, and you can see there's a group of Israeli police, and I opted to kind of go with this picture. But I'd like to, in looking at the subject of Israel, anti-Semitism in history and prophecy, I want to begin by just giving a window into history in brief. You know, it's a prayer meeting, and I don't want to speak to you as a professor type, because that stuff tends to be more informational than inspirational. I could do that. As a graduate student at Cambridge University, I did a lot of research into anti-Semitism, and I was reasonably well informed before I went there to study, being of German Jewish extract myself. Well, I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time to looking at history. Of course, the title is Anti-Semitism in History and Prophecy. I principally want to alight upon prophecy. I want to look at three texts in the Bible, in the beginning of the Bible, the middle, and the end, that kind of give a window into it. But at the outset, I wanted to look at historically, and I opted to go with a book that was written by Mark Twain, a literary giant of a previous generation. In 1898, he wrote an article when he was in Europe. He had gone, as he tells his own story, he's in Austria. And he's there in the parliament. They speak 7 or 8 different languages. They're fussing and fighting. And he had observed then that they fight, they bicker. They only seem to have one thing in common in Austria, and that is all of them, in no uncertain terms, seem to hate Jews. And it kind of got his attention. And he's a literary giant. He's a thinker. And he wrote an article, Stirring Times in Austria, subsequent to which then a Jewish lawyer wrote him and asked him to weigh in on what he thinks the source of anti-Semitism is. That is, why do people hate Jews? And someone wanted to kind of pick his brain on it. In response to that, then, Mark Twain wrote 2 articles for Harper's magazine, which were then published in a little book called Concerning the Jews. And there's a postscript to it. And in looking at the history component, I thought I would just introduce you to Mark Twain's observations. He's not looking at the problem through a religious lens. he's not looking at it through a spiritual lens, but just as a sensitive observer, as one would expect from a literary giant. Now, Twain kind of reflected on it, and in his Concerning the Jews, he observed, first, that Jews aren't a parasitic group leeching off the state. Sometimes if there's a group that's parasitic, that is, it's construed that people aren't pulling their own weight, earning their own monies, but are just tapping into systems that are drawing from the tax base of hardworking people. That can lend itself to a kind of resentment. That is to say, we're working really hard only for someone else to turn around and get handouts doled out. And that can be problematic. Well, in working with the question, why do people hate Jews? Mark Twain kind of looked at the numbers and the culture and what have you, and he says, well, Jews in Austria and Europe, they're not a parasitic group. They're not leeching off the state. Now, it is true that someone can fall upon hard times, but he observed that the Jewish community has a way of rallying behind them and helping their own. So Twain observed that whatever it is that's a source of Jew hatred, it's not economic. Economic comes from the Greek oikos nomos, household rules. Again, it's not that they're parasitic in nature, so he continued on. He says, not only are Jews not parasitic in nature, but Jews don't represent a criminal element harming the state. That is, the people on the whole are not siphoning money out of the state. They tend to be taxpayers that contribute to it. And he said, if you look at the prisons, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Jew in it. It's not that it's hard to catch them. Now, I have a few decades as a police officer, among other things. And I remember taking a prisoner in, and Lieutenant Sharp came out. He was so excited. You know, I'm kind of bringing someone in, and he's walking out. Jeff! He's excited. Yeah, how can I help? He says, I just arrested a Jew. He even had a Star of David. He'd never seen me. He never had one in handcuffs before. Well, Michael, whatever turns you on, but, it's Mark Twain observed that it's not that, you can't say that Jews are a criminal element. So Jews aren't really siphoning off of the state, and they're not damaging it with wayward acts. What then? Mark Twain asked the question from his perspective, why do people hate Jews? According to Twain, the problem is people dislike Jews because they have trouble competing with Jews. This was his reflection. He said that Jews invoke a kind of ire because it's hard to compete and win. And this causes some kind of disconsternation. But then he asked the question, if Jews seem to be reasonably successful in business in Austria and its environs, and that's principally where he's looking, not exclusively, if they seem to be reasonably successful in business, and that's what's invoking the ire, Mark Twain asked, what's the basis of success in business? And Mark Twain said, trust. That is to say, if you're doing business with someone, if you're taking your car to an auto mechanic, can you fix this? You want to be able to trust they're going to open up the hood and they're going to give you work at a reasonable price and fix what's really broken. When you deal with different people, people tend to spend monies with people that they trust. And Mark Twain, again, he reflects on why do people hate Jews? They're not leeching off society. They're not a criminal element in society. Twain says people don't like Jews because it's hard to compete with Jews. Twain then asks the question, well then, what's the essence of success in business? And he says, trust. So it's interesting the way he went full circle. and noted that Jews tend to be a reasonably good lot. He wrote a postscript to it because some were complaining Jews live in different countries, and some resented because they claim they don't jump into the war effort. This is Europe and there's always skirmishes and what have you. But then he did a social study. He got demographic information. No Jews, they jump into the armed forces and they do their duty. It's not like they're asking other men to go fight for them. That as a group, they do their share. Twain raised the question, why do people hate Jews? But he didn't successfully answer it. What I just gave you were his musings, but I want to read you a reasonably lengthy quote, at the end of his piece. Twain says, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. That's overstated. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. That is a very small group. He says properly, against that backdrop, the Jew ought hardly to be even heard of. But he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. That is, a reasonably small people numerically, but an inordinate amount of energies. In fact, today, and I'll just deviate and then return to him, he's writing in 1898, if you were to take the gross national product of Israel today, what's produced there, and if you were to take the gross national product of the 22 Arab Muslim nations round about it, and if you would remove fossil fuels from the equation, a lot of that was found by Western geologists and engineers that didn't get the oil to the ports and send it to the markets. If you were to take the gross national product of Israel, the Jewish state, and compare it to the 22 nation states round about it and take fossil fuels out of the equation, the gross national product of Israel is much higher in terms of what's produced there and what's generated from it. And there's other factors as well. If you look at the number of educated people in the workforce, PhDs, masters, bachelors, et cetera, it's much higher than other people's. If you look at the number of patents per capita in Israel that speak of new inventions, creative thinking, trying to build a better mousetrap, it's way out of proportion to the bulk. If you look at the number of schools per capita, it's much higher in Israel than anywhere else. If you look at hospitals per capita, much higher. If you look at museums per capita in Israel, much higher. It kind of reflects a commitment to living, loving, learning, and growing. Now, of course, Mark Twain is speaking before the nation state of Israel. So Twain says, when you consider how small the people group is, the contributions seem to be way out of proportion. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and obtuse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. When you look at the contributions in these various fields, Twain goes on to say, the Jew, he has made a marvelous fight in this world in all the ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and excused for it. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and faded to dream stuff and passed away. Now, he's looking at history here. If you kind of look at the annals of world history, there were great civilizations that emerged, and they held their torch high for a season. But now they're a shell of what they once were in a previous generation. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians filled the planet and then passed away. The Greeks and the Romans followed and made a vast noise, and now, in effect, they are gone. Maybe a little hyperbolic, not gone, but you don't have that kind of energy that they once had. Other peoples, says Twain, have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out and they sit in twilight now or have vanished altogether. The Jew, says Twain, saw them, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. So what happens is Mark Twain looks at the question of concerning the Jews. He says people hate him, but you look at him and he's confused their reasonably good lot. And he observes that people from time immemorial have hated Jews, persecuted Jews, but those people have come and gone. The Jews still remain. He mentioned the Egyptians. We have a holiday in the Jewish world called Passover. We just celebrate. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. Special foods. That's an Exodus. There's the book of Esther. Yeah, the Persians tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. Special foods. Hanukkah's coming up in December. The Syrians tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. All the holidays. There's a Hebrew expression, Neska Dol HaYashem, a great miracle happened there. The Jewish religious holiday schedule is checkered with memorials to those who hated us and have vanished. Now, of course, today we're looking at the news, and we're just kind of confronted with the fact there's considerable angst. Well, what I wanted to do here was look at anti-Semitism in history and prophecy. And rather than just muse on Mark Twain, this is a prayer meeting. It doesn't beckon an inordinate amount of speculation from non-religious sources. I really want to look at this from an open Bible. And I just want to give a window into it from, protological section of literature, first things. I want to look at the middle section and then eschatological. I want to kind of just do a brief in and out of anti-Semitism in the biblical text. And I want you to see examples of it through storytelling principally. And I'm going to begin I want to look at prophetic literature, the prophetic word, and I want to look at a few different biblical texts, beginning at first in Genesis chapter 39. And what I'll do is I'll briefly recap the story, and then you'll see where I want to land. Yosef was his name, Joseph. And his brothers were jealous of him. They threw him under the bus and sold him into slavery. Joseph is purchased as a slave by someone named Potiphar, who is something of an Egyptian elite. He's a commander of the monarch's Praetorian Guard, so he's a man of some means. And so he's a slave in the house, but there's something different about Joseph, and he's going to be noticed. Potiphar and him, Potiphar is going to see something qualitative in him and elevate Joseph. But Potiphar's out, he's a busy guy, but his wife gets the hots for Joseph. And there's a story here of a cougar who's kind of in the absence of her husband, who's wanting to seduce this young guy, approximate to a teenager, wanting to seduce him. And there's a story here of a noble Joseph who's pushing her off because, he doesn't want to betray his own conscience. He doesn't want to betray his master. He says in the text in the 37th chapter, my master's given me so much. I would hurt him and hurt God, if I would do this. So he keeps pushing her off, but she's insistent only to be spurned. Now, I'm interested in the moment when she was spurned. What happens is finally, as this story plays out in chapter 37, she's tired of getting rejected. So she comes on to him. He pushes her away. She grabs his garment and flees. He flees. She's left there holding the garment, and she's sick of it. Now, what I want to look is see what comes out of her mouth. If you'll look with me, please, in chapter 39. You'll see in verse 12, she grabbed him by the garment, saying, "Come lie with me." He refuses it, runs away. She's had it. She gets upset. She's holding the garment. If you look in verse 14, she screamed. So she's in this reasonably, palatial home, very spacious. She screams and says, "Look, someone brought a Hebrew man to us to fool with us. He approached me to lie with me." Now notice he says someone brought some Jew here. Now the term Jew actually has not worked its way into vocabulary. Hebrew etymologically means beyond the river. Here's this foreigner, this Jew. Now, so what happens is when she complains about him to the workers in the house who are now looking her way, she says, "Look, someone brought this Hebrew in here." And then when her husband comes home, we're told in verse 16, she kept the garment with her until he came home. She spoke the same words to him, saying, "The Hebrew slave that you brought us approached me to fool with me." That Hebrew. Now, all that I want to alight upon in here is I want you to see the racial connotation, which otherwise could have just been construed as a personal insult. It's not even a question of, that man who you brought in here betrayed me. Now, that he's mentioned twice, that Hebrew, it's a racial thing. Now, what's interesting about that, save for Joseph, the other Hebrews haven't even gotten into Egypt yet. It's not like the country's populated by these Hebrews and people are interacting with them. With the net result, they say, "Man, these people, they're just different. We don't like them." No. All you have here is Joseph, and save for the incident with her in the literature, he's a high performer. But when she, for reasons that are uniquely her own, with the upset, when she wants to cast aspersions, the aspersions are not directed to him specifically. Well, they are, but it's framed within the context of the race. It becomes a racial. He brought those people, that person from those people. There's a kind of Hebrew hatred that's noted at the very beginning, and I wanted to alight upon that. I want to look at another example now. I want to look at the beginning of the Bible, and when you look at Genesis in Hebrew, Bereshit, it means beginning. Then I want to go to the middle of the Hebrew Old Testament, and actually the story in the book of Esther is played out in Persia. There's a story here that's worthy of some exploration. If you'll go into the 3rd chapter, I want to look at this a little more. There's a story, again, it plays out in Persia. Now, what's interesting, by the way, is you're going to see this cascading disdain, and you're going to see a plan to exterminate all the Jews in Persia. It's the same sort of thing as you see in Genesis. Damn those people. And I don't mean to cuss in church. I mean, they're saying damn those people. I mean, it's disparagement on steroids based on race. You see it in Genesis. When you're looking here in the book of Esther, it's not just some, verbal expression of disdain, but rather you have mobilizing energies for genocide. And it's explicit in the literature. It's not tacit, it's not inferred, it's explicit. And it's Persia. Now what's interesting, if you have a Bible map, and you say, "Well, gee, I wonder where Persia is." And then if you look at a modern map, and you look at where Iran is, you'd see it's the same place. It just goes by a different name. And by the way, the word Iran itself, it wasn't called Iran until recently. In World War II, when they aligned with Hitler and Mussolini, the name was changed to Iran to comport with Aryan, because the argument was that we're of the same people. And it was the Persians' interest in joining the Federation, and they did. Persians don't understand themselves to be Arabs, but Aryans. Now, there is a kind of being joined with religion, But even the religion in Iran, the Islam in Iran, is markedly different than the Islam in Saudi Arabia. It's Shia Islam, which is distinct from Sunni Islam, and there's tensions that are very deep and very abiding in any place. Here we are in Persia. And there's a story here, if you look in chapter 3, about a man named Haman. And Haman gets elevated. And he's something of a prominent figure. And he kind of leans on the king to make sure that he's celebrated, with the net result that wherever he is, others bow down to him. And they're obsequious, they're deferential toward him. There's a sense in which there's a big ego on steroids, and wherever he goes, per the edict of the king, people bow in his presence. Now, what happens is there was a man in chapter 3, verse 2, who would not bow to him. Recalcitrant, just refuses to bend, won't accept the yoke. And the man's name is Mordecai. Now, when he finds out, he observes this man Mordecai, who has the gall to not, be deferential toward him and grovel in his presence. He inquires about him, and we're told that they told him in verse 4 at the end that he was a Jew. Now, we're not looking at the term Hebrew here, Hebrew, but Jew, from the land of Judea. And then, of course, you're familiar with the religion that evolved out of the land, what's called Judaism. Well, this Haman hears that he's a Jew. He's already upset. Who does this man think he is? If you look in verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him honor, Haman was filled with rage. It was repugnant in his eyes. If you look at the end of verse 6, so Haman sought then to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai. Now, it's an interesting kind of overstatement, if you will. There may well be a better way to say that, just as you find in Genesis, the woman doesn't like Joseph, who spurned her. Okay, so she's enraged at Joseph. I'm not excusing it, but okay, she's at him. But it becomes an issue, those Hebrews, it becomes race. And here too, let's say if, here is one man, a powerful man named Haman, who feels he's not getting the respect he deserves. Now, I get it. Men want respect. I have a respect meter too. I don't need people bowing down to me, but I don't like being disrespected. But one could argue this is something of a petty offense. But even if it was an egregious offense, oh, this guy Mordecai is horrible, it would be an issue between the man Haman and the man Mordecai, but it ceases to be that. That is to say, what's projected here, the problem is with these people, these damn people. And again, I'm not cussing in church, but there's a kind of rage here. And what he does is he puts in motion a plot to exterminate all the Jews. Haman says to the king in verse 8, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom, whose laws differ from those of every other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. There's this people here, these Jews, and they're different. They just don't want to get in lockstep. He says it's not in the king's interest to tolerate them. In verse 9, if it pleases the king, let an edict be written to destroy them. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out the business. Now, you'll see that he sets in motion a decree to exterminate all the Jews. But not content with that, just to show his earnest commitment to it, he commits to an inordinate amount of silver that would amount to $18 million in today's currency, and just kind of retroject back in time thousands of years, $18 million. And this is in response to an offense. I get it. A man is offended. And to tell you the truth, I as a man kind of have to work on this turning the other cheek thing. I mean, there's a sense in which, I'm a type A male kind of guy, and I got a little spring in my step. And I don't abide being insulted. Now, of course, as we make our journey from the womb to the tomb, we're going to be insulted. We're going to run into road bumps on the highway of life. It's not going to not happen. Blessed are the flexible, they will not be broken. There's a sense in which just being successful in life entails absorbing some of that stuff. But here there's an insult, in response to which, out of Persia, it cascades into something entirely different. Now, Mordecai is a reasonably loyal person, more than reasonably loyal, and it comes out later in the literature. But this rage, this hatred, kill them all, these Jews. Not only do it, but I'll throw money into it. We're told then in verse 13 he had success. Dispatches were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces, stating to destroy, slay, and annihilate all the Jews, from the youth to the elderly, both little children and women, on a single day in the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. It's interesting, an edict out of Persia, an edict out of Iran, senseless, out of proportion to the insult. Now, remember the topic here, that what I wanted to do with you is just look at anti-Semitism in Jewish history and prophecy. So for history, I didn't really have time to develop it in large measure. I could even look at the modern era and look at all the bids and attempts to offer two-state solutions and all. I could get into all that, but I won't. For looking at it through an historical lens, I said, well, let it just suffice. Here's Mark Twain, who's a reasonably competent social observer and a literary giant, and he's not like me. I'm of Jewish extract. I have friends. When I'm on the phone in Zoom meetings, it's who's sending their kids into the army over there. And I'm biased. I'm in and out of Israel all the time. My wife, Barry, who gives her regards, couldn't be here today, was supposed to be in Israel today. She was supposed to leave last Wednesday. Of course, flights are shut down. So you could say, well, I don't present to the question of Israel and the current affairs with a tabula rasa. That is, I don't present to it with a blank slate. I have my bias. True. But if you look at someone like Mark Twain, he doesn't have a dog in the fight. He's just looking at 1898. And looking at something that's happening in Europe as he visits Europe. And he goes, gee, what is this? I kind of want to think on this. And he observes it. So I wanted to look at it historically and use him as a snapshot of that. Snapshot of what it is that you and I and we are seeing today. But not content with that, because this is a prayer meeting. Or at least it's a lead up to it. It's not just a history lesson. I thought, well, let me open up biblical literature and just look at a few examples in and out. Look, what do you think of this? Look here in early Genesis. Those Hebrews. For what? What did Joseph do? Those Hebrews, kill them. I think the woman was crazy. And Potiphar, I think, knew she was nuts. He was married to this woman. And the reason why I say it is because here you have this alpha male, a commander of soldiers, an elite, and some slave that he brought into his house is trying to sleep with his wife. If he really believed that's what Joey did, he'd just take him out and kill him. Personally, I think the fact that he'd go, well, this is the offense. My wife is this, but whatever she was, it didn't just surface then and there. We're just getting a window into a moment in biblical literature. My own sense is he may well suspect, how my wife is, and, in my own sense, I don't think Joseph's really like that, so let's just get him out of here instead of just wiping him out. But even if I want to be gracious to Potiphar, the point is you see these it's a hatred of a people. And then when you look here in Esther, A Persian story. This kind of disdain that is set in motion is way out of proportion to the offense. Kill them all, I'll pay for it. And then the language that's used to describe it is remarkable for its similarity, by the way. Dispatchers are sent out stating, destroy, slay, annihilate all the Jews. Hamas couldn't say it any better. From the youth to the elderly. I mean, God, that's on the news. It's on the news. Both the little children and women. That's on the news on a single day. Let's just mark out a period of time and go for it. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that what we saw the other day, this is a prophecy of that. I'm only noting a similarity. And what I'm trying to suggest is when you look at biblical literature, you see this emergent hatred of a people. You see it in the beginning in Genesis, and you're seeing it here with some interaction between one man, Haman, and one man, Mordecai, and it turns into something way out of proportion to the offense. Now, because we see that over and over and over again in history, that is, there's a hatred of Jews for reasons maybe partly real a little bit or totally imagined. You can, the problem with these people today in Israel today is they did this, and thus we do that. Well, whatever the day this and that is, the reality is it just goes on through history, door to door, from generation to generation. And what I wanted to do is look at the history a little, Mark Twain, who's kind of reflecting on it, and then I want to look at some biblical text that reflects on it, and then I want to go to the end. You know, you can find anti-Semitism in the Bible from Genesis to maps, you know, from one end to the other. And what I want to do is go with you to the book of Revelation. Now, it's called Revelation. For something that's called Revelation, it's not the clearest book in the world to understand. You know, I mean, it's so interesting. One could argue it's hardly revealing. And when individuals offer a telling of Revelation, I'm not altogether sure in my mind whether that's what the Bible is saying or whether that's what it is they're concocting on the basis. I don't know whether it's the Holy Spirit leading them or their own imagination. It's like looking at a Rorschach test. Herman Rorschach was a Danish psychiatrist. It's the ink blot test. There's an ink blot, splat. What do you see? Someone says, well, I see a mushroom. Someone sees, I see an atomic bomb. There's another ink blot, splat. What do you see? I see a rocket ship. Someone else, I see a knife. People think they're describing what they're looking at, but it's a projective analysis test. Though they think they're describing what they're seeing on paper, what they wind up doing is describing themselves. That is to say, it's the ink blot that elicits a certain way of perceiving and interacting, and that's what tends to emerge. And there's reasonably good congruity with the test as far as a psychological test, interestingly. In any case, sometimes when individuals look at the book of Revelation, it's kind of like this murky, and then to go into it and offer a telling of it, it's not always clear to me whether that's really what the text is saying or that's the creative imagination of the expositor who's offering a telling of it and who, by the way, has some books in the lobby to help you read about it more at a certain price. But so even with a certain measure of suspicion, I want to enter into the literature here, eschatological text, not protological, not first things, but last things. What I want to do is take a look at the book. And I'm not trying to make a lot of interpretive twists and assessments. I just want to look at it, an interesting passage, and make observations that's used to describe the ragged edge of human history. And the question is, to what extent do we see a disdain for Hebrew peoples in it? I want to see if the anti-Semitism that I think I see in prophetic literature and history is something that cascades into the future and reaches its nadir, that is, its low point. Well, in chapter 12, there's this fantastic vision in verse 1. In heaven, a woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head there's a crown of 12 stars. So there's this vision of this woman which, by the way, harks back to the same vision in Genesis chapter 37 when Joseph dreams a dream. But that's another story. But in any case, so there's this picture here of this, fantastic image of a woman. And then you go on, we're told in verse 5, then another sign appears in heaven. There's this red dragon in verse 4. His tail sweeps away the stars of heaven. We're told the dragon in verse 7 stands before the woman who was about to give birth to, that whenever she gave birth, he might devour her child. So there's this picture of this woman, and she is in travail, she's in labor. But then there's this serpentine figure, this dragon, who presents. And just as she's about to give birth, the dragon is there to destroy what comes out of her womb. To destroy. But we're told in verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was snatched away to God and to his throne. Now, there's the picture here. There's Jesus Christ who makes his entrance onto the stage of the human drama, who comes through the Hebrew people. If you look at the Matthean Gospel and Lucan Gospel, both have genealogies. And in no uncertain terms, both authors go out of great pains to show that Jesus is descended from Hebrew people. Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, has a Semitic original. It's Sefer Toldot HaYeshua Mashiach ben David ben Avraham. It says the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. First breath of the New Testament connects Jesus to the people. But you haven't read much beyond that till all of a sudden you see when Jesus makes his entrance onto the stage of the human drama, there's this nefarious individual that's trying to kill the Christ child. In response to which then Jesus, the royal family, is kind of warned in a dream, and the royal family's got to get out of Dodge. You have in the Matthean text, they flee. Now, here in the Revelation in apocalyptic literature, there is this woman with the sun, the moon, and the stars, which is used in early Genesis explicitly as the Hebrew peoples. And what happens is finally you have this child who's the Mashiach, the Messiah, this anointed one, makes a stage on the entrance of the human drama amidst the turbulence of trying times. You have this diabolical personality here trying to destroy the child. But what happens is the child is taken away, goes up to God and to his throne. Now, we're told that this dragon, this is a story that took place in heaven, the dragon is thrown down to earth, we're told in the literature. And this is where I want to kind of pick up as we close down. We're told already in verse 9, the dragon was thrown down. If you look in verse 13, now when the dragon saw that he had been thrown to the earth, he stalked the woman who had given birth to the child. That is, when the devil saw that the child who was to rule the nations got away, but we're told that this heinous personality then is hell-bent on destroying the woman. That is to say, the family, the lineage through which this child came. We're told that the woman takes flight from him. And we're told in verse 15, but from out of his mouth the serpent spewed out water like a river after the woman in order to sweep her away with a flood. We're told finally, as we get to the end of the chapter, so the dragon became enraged at the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. In other words, never mind the one who came through her. Never mind the one. That what it is we're just going after all the kitties in the litter. Now, I said all that to say this. Today what I wanted to do was look at anti-Semitism in biblical literature. What did anybody learn from a brief telling of anti-Semitism in history and prophecy? Well, I'll leave that to you to decide for yourself. What I want to do next week is take some time to look at biblical literature and not just speak in general terms or some spiritual terms about this. There's something, I really do think it's from the pit of hell. It defies logic. I mean, if you tried to make sense of why people hate Jews, whatever your answer to is it in some rational sense, it's not going to hold up, really, because it's spiritual more than it is material. And what I wanted to do was take a look at the book. Mark Twain didn't do that, but he's not a Bible professor. He's a social observer, and a good one at that. And all that I wanted to do here this evening with this is just observe with you this kind of perennial angst, this kind of hatred, this hatred of Jewish people, and we're seeing it raise its hoary head today. Now, next week, when we come back, if you do come back, I want to take a look at a story. And if you can just, I want to see if I can get it up here. I have one more. Well, maybe I don't. Maybe that was my last slide. Yeah, I guess it was my last slide. You don't even know what slides you have? I just made it before I started today. It's not like I come out, here's my canned spiel. Steve wants me to give a talk, here's my spiel. No, it comes fresh out of the oven, baby. Just cooked it up, So wasn't quite sure where the end was. But inasmuch as today, I just wanted to observe with you this perennial problem, and I wanted to postulate, I wanted to formally put forth that it's spiritual, not material. Then it needs to be answered spiritually with prayer and faith and standing. And what you want to do, the Hebrew Bible beckons believers, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. You want to stand with your Jewish friends, neighbors, co-workers, relatives, by birth, kinship, or by marriage and association. You want to stand with. You just want to do that. You don't want to be unkindly disposed toward Muslim peoples. I spent some time today with a very good friend of mine who's an assistant imam in Dallas. And he's one of the leaders of the Islamic community. I got better things to do than hate people. Because from my perspective, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spirits and principalities. And by the way, not every Muslim is Hamas. Georgetown University did a field study, wanted to kind of explore Muslim attitudes. And there were 1 million interviews. It was very thorough. And with 1 million interviews, with assembling the qualitative data together, that they found that 93% of individuals who are of Islamic persuasion have no interest in bearing arms, peace-loving people. That's the good news. The bad news is there's still 7%. And if you're looking at a lot of people, that still is considerable. But nevertheless, you don't want to be a hater, and you don't want to assume it. What I want to do next week is take a look at the world at war. I want to look at what the Bible says about history's end game. And if you come back next week and are game to explore it with me, you don't have to agree with anything I say. You don't have to agree with any of this. I don't know how you could refute it, but that's, I don't live in your head, you don't live in mine, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. Similarly, next week, if you're inclined to do so, what I want to do is take a look at history's endgame. And what you're going to see is it entails, in no uncertain terms, an emergent Israeli nation state at the ragged edge of time. And what you're going to see when you look at biblical literature is the emergence of that state invokes the ire of people round about. And those tensions cascade, and it goes to war, the likes of which we've yet to see. Well, that's history's endgame. Are we there? I make no such claims. But what I do want to do with you next week is we'll take a look at the book. Well, it's a scary topic. It's not a happy prayer meeting. Well, let's just kind of get happy here. I mean, you could argue it's a tough talk. But, the good news about a bad news world is that the end of the story has already been written, and we know it. Actually, when I look at the book of Revelation, if I wanted to give a theme to that nebulous book, nebulous, it's a little cloudy, however you interpret the particulars, that one of the things you see in no uncertain terms is the eventual triumph of God in human history. And that's what we believe for, not just in human history in some global sense, But what you want to experience is the triumph of God in your own story, never mind his story. And by the way, the word history comes from two words, his story. It even has a religious motif associated with it. And it was born out of an understanding, if you look at the Judeo-Christian principles that have been lost, even in the evolution of our own language. It's kind of laden with theological perspective. Even the word history itself derives from his story. And you and we have the opportunity to participate in it. Speaking of which, as I close, thank you for taking the time to participate this evening, even participating as a passive observer and learner. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share. I hope you've found some value in it. And next week, I'm going to be drawing from a book that I wrote some time ago. It's called The Iranian Menace in Jewish History and Prophecy. I've got nothing against Iranian people, but long before this current malaise, what I did is I looked at a variety of first century interpreters of Jewish literature and Christian literature, and you look at the ancient sources, the way they understood. Never mind what I might so happen to think about history's endgame. I want to look at biblical literature, and I want to refract it through people that were staring at it in century 1. And there's an example. We can look at what's happening in the world today, look at what's happening in the Word yesterday, and you can decide if you see any connection. Philosophical speculations aside about history's endgame, I beckon you, please, stand with your Jewish friends. You know, people are hurting right now. I was smuggled out of my mother was smuggled out of Nazi Germany by nuns. And so, a lot of us, we're just the next generation of Jews in the world. I came to know Jesus and experienced a kind of peace associated with that. A lot of Jewish people don't have that peace and ultimate confidence. But it's a wonderful time for you to stand with your Jewish friends, neighbors, co-workers. I beg you, please do that and do what you can at this time. I tried, by the way, I contacted a number of sources in Israel. I'm old police. I know how to point and fire a gun. Can you use me? But they thought maybe 68 years old was just a tad bit too old. What can I say? I got some fire in my bones because I don't like anybody hurting my people. Thank you for being here this evening, and I do beg you, stand with the Jewish people. Thank you.